Hi everyone, this is Jim. Welcome to round 5 coverage of my games from the 2018 Oregon Open. Round 5 was played Monday morning at 9:30 a.m. That was the earliest start time of the match, or of the tournament. And I had had a long day the day before. That the first game on Sunday started at 10 and the second game didn't start until 6 p.m. And both of the games I played were quite long. So I was probably a little bit sleep deprived at this point, as well as there's some cumulative effect of playing one long game after another. But in any case, I was feeling pretty good because I'd actually played pretty well the day before. That was probably the best. My best play of the tournament so far was the previous day, and so I was feeling pretty good about my ability, but I think looking at this game afterwards, there's some signs of sleepiness here. Also, my score sheet, there's another sign. I made a lot of errors in my score sheet, writing white's moves in the black's column and things like that. So another sign of a bit of sleepiness or exhaustion setting in. Anyway, white, my opponent here, was one of the young kids, so another elementary school aged kid whose rating was 1767 and my rating was 1834. So my strongest opponent of the tournament so far. White starts off with d4. I play knight f6. And now knight c3. Bit of an offbeat move. I continue with d5 and now bishop to f4. So this is the Jobava attack, and it's actually a little bit surprising to me to see this coming from such a young player. Usually the young players play very standard openings, so it's kind of interesting. I don't know if white was just experimenting with this or if this is a standard part of the repertoire. But here I had looked at this position before, and I had concluded that c5 was the best move. I did a opening basics series video on the Jobava attack, and then I also did that black repertoire against d4 sidelines. And I often recommend getting in this c5 move as an antidote to a lot of these sidelines, and it works here as well. If white goes knight b5 immediately, threatening the fork, you can throw in the check, and it's very important the knight is not defended here, and so the check can't simply be blocked, and the knight has to retreat to save some immediate material loss. Actually, and I think white's in pretty big trouble after this. It's lost a tempo and the knight is pinned. So that's no good. Let's back up. So instead of that, white plays e3 here, and then you have time to play a6, and that will keep the knight from hopping into this square. And this is a fine position. If white takes, you can always round up the pawn with queen a5, so you're not sacrificing anything, and you get a decent position with black. You're going to continue with knight to c6 and try and get in the e5 move if you can. White will prevent it with the knight coming out, then you'll settle for e6, I guess, and develop the bishop. Anyway, all that should be fine. But somehow I couldn't work it out over the board. I mean, it's important to understand, I knew that c5 was the right move, but I couldn't work out the details of the various variations after that. And so I ended up not playing it. I'm not going to play a move if I can't figure out what my next response is going to be. But looking at it now, it wasn't that hard to figure out. So that's the first sign of a little bit of sleepiness on my part. So I played the move c6, which is solid, but a little bit passive. White continues with e3, and now I go e6. And definitely this is not the right way to play it. If you want to set up this solid wall here, that's okay, but probably developing this bishop outside the pawn chain before playing e6 is the way to go. After e6, black definitely has a cramped position, and white is for choice. White has easy development here. So bishop d3, bishop d6, knight f3, I go queen e7. So I have an idea here with queen e7 where I'm going to play knight b to d7 and push the e-pawn forward. I saw this idea in the two London system games that I played recently and did videos about on my channel. And this, white's structure here is a lot like the London system with the bishop outside the pawn chain. So it's not a bad plan, but white can stop it, and white does. So white castles here, and I play knight bd7 as I planned, and then white just plunks a knight down on e5. And here I realized things were not really working out for me as I had hoped. So obviously you can't take the knight because the pawn, well, you can't take the knight with this knight because the pawn takes back and forks these two pieces. You don't really want to give up the bishop here and leave white with this good bishop. So, it's not so easy to move this knight out of the way to play f6 and kick the knight out of the way. So things are just a little bit clogged up, and this knight is also in the way of this bishop. I was just kind of looking around for a plan, and I came up with kind of a peculiar move. So let's, before I show you my move, let's show you some of the things the Chess Engine recommends. I think one of the top choices is g6. I didn't quite get this idea at first. Well, it does blunt the bishop, but it does leave this dark squared weaknesses around here, and my bishop is over on this side. But part of the idea here is it supports the knight coming to h4, so the knight is defended there. It couldn't go there directly. No, the knight coming to h5, I mean. Couldn't go there directly because the queen was guarding that square. So anyway, that's a way to activate my pieces, and also makes room for this knight to come into the game. So that's one way to play. Another way to play is simply to castle. And Chess Engine says black should be okay here, but this is, I don't know, I think this is a little bit dangerous. White is pretty well coordinated here for a kingside attack, so I would not be so keen to castle immediately. And also, the position is fairly closed, so it seemed to me at the time that there wasn't any immediate need to castle. And I played the move knight to f8. So that was my peculiar plan. Well, I'm getting the knight out of the way of the bishop. I'm clearing up this square on d7 for either the bishop or maybe this knight to come over. And this knight is going to find a nice square on g6 there and put some pressure on this knight from the other side. So all that is well and good, but it's a bit slow, and white here can strike immediately with e4. And this is something to keep in mind when you're playing these attacking systems with white, where you have the knight on c3. That knight is in a good position to support this c4 pawn break. So this should always be on your radar screen, whether you are playing the Jobava attack with the bishop coming to f4. There's also a similar system with the knight to c3 and the bishop to g5, known as the Richter-Veresov attack. And that also has the same idea of pushing e5. In fact, it's even stronger in that case because this bishop is putting pressure on the knight here. So, well, first of all, I meant pushing the pawn to e4. So with the bishop, you imagine the bishop on g5 putting pressure on this knight also weakens the e4 square, or strengthens it from white's point of view, and makes that e4 push possible. So that's something, when you're playing these setups with white, that's something you should be on the lookout for. So fortunately for me, my opponent didn't play with the pawns, but moved the queen out. So just active piece play. It's not a bad move, but e4 was just better there. So this gives me time to complete my knight maneuver. I get my knight to g6, and now white goes bishop to g3, not wanting to trade off that good bishop. And I play bishop to d7. And now I think white makes the first mistake here. White has a pretty good position. Even this queen f3 move, even though it wasn't best, was still good. But the mistake white makes here is to trade with knight takes d7. This is a bad bishop. I put it there offering the trade, and I'm not unhappy to get rid of that piece there. I have a cramped position, so trading minor pieces is to my benefit, and also this is my worst piece. So white is taking a good knight and trading it for a bad bishop, and so it's just not a good trade. The Chess Engine would play very actively here and just go for it on the king side with h4. and that would face I would face some difficult questions at that point. But in any case, white took the bishop, I took back with the queen, and so I've survived the opening, and things are around equal. Let's see. White continued exchanging, and at that point, that's not a bad exchange actually for white. There's nothing that bishop can really do. And then rook a to d8, rook a to d1, playing actively with the rooks. I finally castle, and now taking the knight on g6. This is interesting. I could play h takes g6, and that's the normal move here, but I was kind of tempted to take the other way and try and get some play along the f file. So I took this way. But there is a tricky tactical sequence here that white has that leads white to, once again, a pretty good position. So this is maybe a chance for you guys to think about this position for a while. What would you play here as white, and do you see some clever tactical ideas here? Okay, I'm going to give the answer away now. Pause the video if you want time to think about it. First you have to notice that the rook is opposite the queen, and so your natural tendency is to want to do something about that. But in fact, it appears there's no really killer discovery I have with the knight, and white can play this move, e4. And now you might think, oh, this is good. I can just grab a pawn with a tempo on the queen. But here's where the tactics come in. White can just take the knight because even though the queen is hanging, my queen is also hanging. So in fact, I should just take the knight there rather than taking the queen. The queen takes the pawn. And if you look at this position, now the weakness of taking with the f-pawn is apparent in that it left this e-pawn isolated. And so this is just a slightly better end game for white. It's a heavy piece end game with a target to play against. Not necessarily winning for white, but certainly good chances. So that would be best play here. Instead, white played the natural move, queen to e2. And that lets me get in the move e5, which I'd been wanting to play since the opening, basically. I've been trying to arrange this e5 break. And this is a good time for it. White takes, I take back, and I think we're still in the range of about even, but I'm feeling pretty good about my position. Let's see, white played h3 here to keep my knight out of the g4 square and give some lift to the king. Went rook a to e8. Yeah, I guess at this point, I guess is where I was starting to feel good about my position. I managed to open up these files and get my rooks over here. So whereas earlier in the opening I was behind in development, now if you look at it, I think I'm ahead in development because I've gotten my rooks onto the open files quicker than white has. But it's not a decisive advantage by any means. And white continues to play well, starting with the queen to d3. And here, the chess engine is recommending the move g5. I wasn't really sure where this g5 pawn was going. I thought, if I ever pushed on to g4, white can just play h4 and let that pawn pass it by. But, well, we'll come back to this point later because for some reason during this game I never really fire with the g-pawn. And it's kind of a typical idea here. I'm not sure why I never went for that. I'm not sure I spent much time thinking about it. What I was really thinking about here was the central squares and the fact that this knight is preventing my knight from coming into that juicy e4 square. And so I'm just trying to dislodge the knight, and I start out with this move b5. And I was expecting some kind of move like h3 to prevent it. But white came up with a clever response here. White played queen to d4. I didn't really want to trade queens here. I was thinking, I've got a pretty good attacking position. But it's actually a bit of a tricky move for me to answer because the queen is also attacking the f-pawn. The a-pawn over here. If I take the queen directly, then white can take back with a pawn, and there'll be 4 pawns holding back 4 pawns, 3 against 3. Be a very even position. So I don't really want to go for that at this point. I want to try and keep some kind of advantage or winning chances. So I played rook f7. I just defended this pawn with my rook, and the rook lift may prove to be useful. And if white takes my queen now, then I can take back with the rook, and I have more active pieces for the endgame, and I still have this asymmetry in the pawn structure. I've got 4 against 3 over here, and white has 4 against 3 over here. So it would still be an interesting game at that point. But white had spotted another weakness in my structure over here, caused by that b5 push. Yeah, this c-pawn is undefended. So I drop my queen back to defend that, and then white brings the other rook into the game. So, you know, white is pretty much equalized by this point. We're back to, you know, it was never all that far away from equal, in fact. But this is, you can see that in terms of development, white's pieces are all active now. Let's see. So I'm looking around for a plan. I try this rook b7 move. One advantage I still have in this position is I have a little more space, and I can fire my pieces back and forth, or shuffle my pieces back and forth along the back ranks and try different things. So this move here does finally provoke a3. And then at this point I didn't really see a big continuation. If I continue with a4, or a5 rather, white can always block with b4, and it didn't seem to be making much progress at that point. The chess engine also points out, I was kind of curious about this later, if I had played a5 here, the chess engine even recommends this move e4 once again. That break in the center, something you should always keep in mind. And then after some exchanges, knight takes, d takes, this rook can penetrate to d6. So white lost a pawn here, but white is going to get this pawn, and the rooks are active now. This looks like a fine position for white. So there's no value in continuing to push on here on the queen side. I brought the rook back. I decided to just line up on the e-file, and I had another idea here. I was going to drop my queen back so that it's out of the way of the rooks, put my knight here, allow this trade of knights, and get a rook to this square, with the idea of bringing the rook to c4 there, chasing the queen away and hitting this c-pawn. So a bit of an elaborate plan, but you know, you've got to have some ideas. And the interesting thing is, it's almost as if my opponent was reading my mind, because white played b3 here, which does not make a lot of sense on the surface, but it takes away that idea of lifting a rook up and bringing it over here to c4. Makes the queen's position there more secure. So pretty interesting play from white. Let's see, I dropped my queen back out of the way anyway. I think I still want to try and activate my rooks, maybe at the cost of a knight trade here. And white plays rook to e2. I went with queen b7 here. I wasn't really ready to fire and allow that knight trade. I wasn't sure how that would work out. Let's see. Once again, the chess engine is recommending g5 here, by the way. But queen b7 is not bad. Let's see. White goes ahead and doubles, so following up logically with the plan. I push on with a5. And here, white moves the queen to d4. I guess with this pawn out of the way, no longer sitting on a7, you know, maybe this queen position here was not so great. Maybe white was just having trouble finding a plan. I'm just not sure why the queen was moved in exactly this moment, because it does control all the same squares. It does still control the, or put pressure on the that b square. One thing I wanted to point out is that I'm playing a5 at a moment when b4 is not that useful a move for white. That was what I was worried about before. But now b4 does something for me. It frees up control of the c4 square. So I would follow through with this plan of knight here, and the exchange, and then the rook up and over if white played b4 there. So I wasn't so worried about that move anymore, and I went ahead and played a5. White dropped the queen back to d4, and I just pushed on with b4. So I'm finally kicking this knight away and getting control of that juicy e4 square. So I'm starting to feel pretty good about my position, but as I was saying earlier about another position, it's still all within the range of about even somehow. So I chase the knight away, and I decide, I thought about this knight move. It's a nice looking piece there, but I can't really come into the c3 square so easily with this knight on a4 guarding it. So, and the knight also is guarding this square. So it's not so clear what the knight on e4 would do at the moment. I was thinking maybe rook e4 is the way to go. And this seems to be a good move. After white played queen b2, at least it's a good move. But white had another reply here. So another chance for you to spot a tactical response from white. Yeah, this is interesting. I discovered this after the game. I really didn't think about it during the game because I figured I'm threatening the queen. But once again, the knight can move with a threat on my queen. And not only is it a threat, it's also a fork. So if I just move my queen aside, then white can take the rook and just be up the exchange. So in fact, best play is I'm pretty much forced to take the queen. White has to take the queen. Then I can either save the rook or trade. I think the chess engine recommended trading. And we get this endgame, which is even. So that's definitely an equalizing line for white. I mean, I have some advantages here. And I can come into this square and maybe get to c3, but well, this knight has time to get back into the game. Again, I guess it's not easily defending c3. It takes 2 moves to get back here. But the other point is I also still have these doubled pawns here, which may be a weakness as the game continues. Anyway, sort of compensating advantages and disadvantages, leading to about an even position. But anyway, white did not go for that. White just dropped the queen back. And then I brought my queen back to the center with queen e7. Queen e7 is also looking at this c5 square. I didn't want this knight getting back into the game so easily. Now that it's on the side of the board, I want to keep it over there. But white figures out a way to liberate the knight with c3. And then here, this is the point where I was going to explore that g5 option. This is maybe one of the best times in the game to play g5, and I really didn't think about it here. I was thinking, white is going to take here, and then, white will have this nice square, or maybe this one for his knight coming into the game. I can, in fact, push on with g4 here, and here's the idea. If white plays with h4, I can keep pushing and push all the way to g3, and then one way or another I'm going to win this e-pawn that I've piled up on. So that's a very nice tactical idea. And of course, if white doesn't push past here, that's really the main thing I was worried about, then I will take over here and open up the king side. So in either case, I get this nice center pawn, or I get this, or I get to open up the king side. So that's interesting tactical idea to keep in mind, especially when you have this kind of pressure on a central pawn like this. If you can slip this pawn forward and undermine it, just throw it forward, sacrifice it to take care of the center pawn. But there is another line here. Let's go back to the move g5. So I played g5 here. Now white takes. I go g4. White doesn't have to move the h-pawn here. White can move the knight and attack my rook. And this is where it gets a little bit too complicated for me to calculate. But the chess engine likes to sacrifice the exchange. So I just thought it was interesting from that point of view. So what do you get? You take a pawn over here. White takes a knight. White takes a rook. You take back the knight, so you get your knight on a good square. And let's see, rook to d4, because white wants to hold on to his material, not give the exchange back. And you can play queen g5, threatening checkmate. White can respond with g3, and then you can play queen g4. Now this is not a completely winning position. I mean, there's all kinds of dangerous threats particularly this one coming in and mating. But it turns out to be defensible. I guess the plan here would be king h2 and rook to g1 to defend against that. But it gives this position a slight edge for black. So what this means is that black has compensation for the exchange. If we count the material, how many pawns? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Yeah, it's a pure exchange. So it's interesting. Black is just down the exchange, but white's king side is weakened and black's pieces are really well posted. Maybe another idea is to try and gang up on this f pawn here, although it can be defended from the side. Anyway, there's no immediate breakthrough for black, but maybe a slight edge, and that's how the chess engine would play this game from this point forward. Anyway, let's back up. And as I mentioned before, I never really thought about this g5 move. So, but this was maybe the best chance for me to play it. Instead, I played queen e5. I'm not entirely sure what I was thinking, because this leads to some exchanges here. White takes, I take. And then, I guess that this would be a good position for me with the rook here putting pressure on this isolated pawn. But, this knight is going to get into the game. I have some weak pawns here as well. And the chess engine actually gives a slight edge to white in this position. So it was not, I was still, during the game, I was still thinking I was ahead in this line. That's why I went for it. Let's see. White went with knight to c5. I went with rook to a8. So thinking of maybe doing something along the a file here. White starts to bring the king in with king f1. Actually, king f1 was flagged as a bit of a mistake by the chess engine. The chess engine likes rook to c1 and just playing actively with the pieces for white. So say I go rook to b6, maybe, and take that one back. Rook to b6, just defending this pawn against any discoveries. So the knight moves that this pawn is defended. Then white can play g4. I can block with g5, and then rook b to c2, doubling on the c file. Just piling up like that. And it looks pretty good, I have to admit, for white. So that seems to be a good way to play. I might be forced to play a move like this, which not an attractive move for black to play. That would leave me with a weak pawn on e4 that white could try and exploit. And in addition to this weakness, although with the knights traded off, I would probably grab this pawn. So it might still end up in a draw, but anyway, that's best play for white. Anyway, white played what I think is the more natural move, king to f1. It's that stage in the endgame where you want to get your kings active. Played king to f7. White went king to e2, king e7. Now rook to c1 here. And my king is close enough to help defend this pawn. I think that's the key difference, is if white had quickly piled up on that pawn while my king was over on the other side of the board, that might have led to a bigger edge for white. And I think this is all just about even. Let's see. I went, it's white's turn. White went rook b to c2, doubling on the c file. I dropped this rook back, so it's defended. And white went with f3, so it keeps my knight from hopping into any of these squares and frees this knight up to move away. So I went knight d7. I decided to challenge that knight right away. White went for the trade. And then white went f4. And this actually leads to some chances for me, I thought. Let's see. Yeah, the chess engine is just recommending sitting on the position with something like king f2. So this is probably just an even position, and there's not much that white can do. f4 is a little bit... well, I suppose the idea is to try and restrain my pawns and maybe go after them later, but it does create some weaknesses here. Let's see how this continues. I go rook a to a6. I wanted to defend this c pawn here securely and free up my king to try and wander in on the light squares. That was the first thing I thought of when I saw this f4 move, is that there's some light squared weaknesses. And I was going to play the move h5 as well to try and get my king here, play h5, threaten to come in here. Anyway, yeah, those are the kind of ideas I had. And let's see, white continued with rook to c3, defending the b pawn. But this left an opening here. So at this point, I was getting pretty optimistic. I played rook a2 check. And now, however white blocks, if white blocks with the rook, I will just trade it off and then take the c pawn here and be a pawn up. So the king is forced back. The king has to move. White chose to put the king on f3. I think that's the best choice. And then I get my rook behind this pawn, rook to b2. But, well, unfortunately for me, it's all, I mean, I'm winning this pawn, but white has counterplay. So rook to a1. And, white is coming in with a check and is going to pick up some pawns over here on the king side. But I calculated this part out pretty well, I think. I decided it's okay to give up a pawn or two over here, particularly if I can get a passed pawn on the queenside over here with the king out of the way. So I went ahead and grabbed, and white exchanged, and then came in with the rook check. So I played king to e6, and now I'm threatening with king to e6. I'm threatening this move d4. This actually is a playable move. White could have taken here, and then I would have gone d4. So it's just a trade. I was thinking this pawn would be very dangerous, but actually the chess engine still rates this as about even, but white wasn't willing to risk that, and I certainly wouldn't have played that way either if I were white. That seems like a pretty dangerous way to play, asking for trouble. So king e2, just getting away from the pin. So now that d pawn comes forward, it's going to be stopped. And now I went with rook b2 again. The king went to f3, and then I went h5. So I wasn't going for the repetition. I was just going for the idea of trying to improve my king position. I allowed white to take this one pawn. Then I played king f6. So I'm defending this pawn and chasing the rook away. The rook went to c7, attacking my pawn, and I went here, defending it. And then white went with h4 here. So I was thinking, still maybe this is something for me. I tried rook c3 again, threatening once again that d4 push. White goes king e2, and I step my king forward finally. And white has this check. Unfortunately, yeah, I'd seen that this check was a problem, but I couldn't find anything better. So I can go forward on either side, but there's not much I can do, right? I can go forward to this side. Well, I didn't play this, but let's just give an example. I could go forward here, but white could attack this pawn, and if I try and win a pawn here, actually get pinned over on the side of the board or trapped, and white is doing quite well in this position, so I can't go that way. Let's see. I went ahead and moved my king forward in this direction, threatening the check here. This would certainly be good for me, but of course white has this check to save the position, and I have nothing better than going back. So we agreed to a draw in this position. Anyway, pretty interesting game. I think I did reasonably well. Actually, I think both sides played that game pretty well. I point out places in the game where there were opportunities for one side or the other to take an advantage, but there was never a position in the game where one side or the other was clearly winning. So it was a little bit of back and forth, but it was just in terms of advantage to white or advantage to black. So draw is a reasonable result, and stay tuned for final round coverage coming up. See you then. Bye.